Along the banks of the ancient Nile, where papyrus reeds sway gently in the eternal breeze, and the golden sands stretch endlessly toward distant horizons, there began a story that would echo through the corridors of time for over 5,000 years. The river flows as it has always flowed, carrying with it the fertile black silt that transforms the desert into a ribbon of green abundance. Whispering secrets of ages long past, when the first great civilization took root in its nurturing embrace. In those distant days, when the world was young and the gods walked closer to the earth, the land that would become Egypt existed as two separate realms, each with its own character, its own deities, its own proud traditions. Upper Egypt stretched southward, a narrow valley carved by the river's ancient course, where limestone cliffs rose like cathedral walls on either side of the life-giving waters. Here, in this elongated oasis, settlements clustered around the riverbank, like children gathering at their mother's feet, their mud-brick homes and temples reflecting in the slow-moving current. The people of this southern realm wore the white crown of their ancestors, a tall, conical headdress that rose toward the heavens like a prayer made manifest. And they paid homage to the fierce goddess Nekhbet, the vulture deity who spread her protective wings over their communities. Their king ruled from ancient Hierakonpolis, a sacred city where the falcon god Horus was believed to have first touched the earth, and where the divine essence of kingship itself was said to dwell among the shadows of towering temple walls. To the north lay Lower Egypt, a vast delta where the great river spread its waters across countless channels before surrendering to the Mediterranean Sea. This was a land of marshes and waterways, of abundant fish and fowl, where papyrus grew thick and tall, rustling with the movements of countless creatures that made their homes within its green sanctuary. The people of this northern kingdom wore the red crown, a curious cap with a tall projection that curved forward like the neck of a striking cobra, and they worshipped Wadjet, the serpent goddess whose watchful eyes were said to guard the delta's mysteries. Their rulers held court in the ancient city of Pe, modern-day Buto, where the goddess herself was believed to manifest in the form of a rearing cobra, ready to strike down any who would threaten her chosen people. For countless generations, these two lands existed in their separate spheres, each developing its own rich tapestry of customs, beliefs, and artistic traditions. The boundary between them was marked by Memphis, a strategic point where the river valley began to open into the delta's embrace, and here traders from both realms would meet to exchange goods, stories, and occasionally suspicious glances. The air itself seemed different at this confluence, charged with the tension of two worlds meeting, two different ways of understanding the relationship between the human and the divine, between the mortal realm and the eternal mysteries that lay beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension. Yet even in this separation, there existed a shared understanding that ran deeper than political boundaries or territorial disputes. Both kingdoms recognized the profound significance of the Nile, the great river that was more than mere water and silt, but rather the very bloodstream of creation itself. They shared similar languages, similar architectural techniques, and most importantly, a similar conception of kingship as something sacred, something that transcended the merely human and touched the realm of the gods. Their rulers were not simply political leaders or military commanders, but living bridges between the world of mortals and the eternal realm where the deities held court among the stars. It was into this world of two kingdoms that a figure emerged whose name would become the foundation stone of Egyptian civilization, though the exact details of his life have become wrapped in the golden mist of legend and the shifting sands of time. Nama, whose name means the catfish, rose from the southern kingdom with a vision that would transform not only the political landscape of the Nile Valley, but the very nature of human authority and divine kingship. Whether through conquest or negotiation, through military might or diplomatic brilliance, or perhaps through some combination of all these elements, Nama achieved what no ruler before him had managed to accomplish. The famous palette that bears his name, carved in green schist and dating to around 3100 BCE, tells the story in images more powerful than words. On one side, the king appears wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. his mace raised high as he strikes down a kneeling enemy, while the falcon god Horus looks on approvingly, holding a rope that leads to the conquered lands of the Delta. On the reverse side, the same ruler appears wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, striding confidently behind standard-bearers as he surveys the aftermath of battle, where the decapitated bodies of his enemies lie arranged in neat rows, their severed heads placed between their feet in a display that speaks of total victory. But this was more than mere conquest, more than the simple subjugation of one people by another. What Nama achieved was the creation of something entirely new in human history, the forging of a unified kingdom that would endure for 3 millennia and establish the template for divine kingship that would influence civilizations across the ancient world. The crown he wore in official ceremonies was neither the white crown of the south nor the red crown of the north, but the double crown, the Shent, which combined both symbols into a single powerful statement of unified authority. This was not replacement, but integration, not the destruction of ancient traditions, but their synthesis into something greater than the sum of its parts. The implications of this unification rippled outward, like stones dropped into still water, transforming every aspect of Egyptian society and laying the foundation for achievements that would astonish the world. With political unity came cultural flowering, as artists and craftsmen from both kingdoms shared their techniques and inspirations, creating new forms of expression that blended the artistic traditions of both realms. The hieroglyphic writing system, which had been developing separately in both kingdoms, now evolved into a unified script that would serve as the foundation for all future Egyptian literature, religious texts, and administrative records. More profound still was the theological revolution that accompanied political unification. The king was no longer merely a ruler blessed by the gods, but became the living embodiment of divine power on earth, the physical manifestation of Horus, the falcon god who soared between heaven and earth. This concept of divine kingship would become the bedrock of Egyptian civilization, creating a system where the pharaoh served as the crucial link between the human realm and the world of the gods, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay and ensured the continued functioning of the universe itself. In the royal workshops of the newly unified kingdom, craftsmen began creating objects of unprecedented beauty and sophistication, their work reflecting the confidence and ambition of a civilization that saw itself as the earthly reflection of divine order. Gold gleamed in the hands of master metalworkers. Precious stones were cut and polished to catch and reflect the sacred light of Ra, and scribes carefully recorded the deeds and proclamations of their god-king on papyrus scrolls that would preserve these moments for eternity. The great river continued its eternal flow, but now it carried with it the dreams and aspirations of a united people, their prayers and offerings floating downstream toward the delta, where they would mingle with the waters of the Mediterranean and carry word of Egypt's greatness to the wider world. As the great river continued its eternal journey toward the Mediterranean, carrying with it the fertile silts that would nurture a civilization for millennia, the newly unified kingdom under divine rule began to take shape around a landscape that would become sacred beyond measure. Where the Nile Delta spread its fingers into countless waterways, at the very junction where Upper and Lower Egypt met, there rose a city that would embody the eternal power of the pharaohs and serve as the beating heart of the Old Kingdom. Memphis, whose ancient name, Mennefer, meant enduring and beautiful, stretched along the western bank of the great river, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the desert sun like polished limestone against the deep blue of the Egyptian sky. The location of Memphis was no accident of geography, but a deliberate choice that spoke to the profound understanding the ancient Egyptians possessed of both the practical and spiritual dimensions of their world. Here, where the narrow valley of Upper Egypt opened into the broad expanse of the Delta, where the red crown of Lower Egypt could gaze upon the white crown of Upper Egypt across the flowing waters, the pharaohs established their eternal seat of power. The city itself became a living symbol of unification, its very existence proclaiming that the two lands had become one under the divine authority of the king who was both mortal ruler and living god. Within the sacred precincts of Memphis, the great temple of Ptah rose like a mountain of carved stone, its massive pylons casting shadows that moved across the courtyards with the stately progression of the sun god Ra across the heavens. Ptah, the creator deity, who was said to have spoken the world into existence through the power of divine speech, found his earthly dwelling place in chambers filled with the sweet smoke of incense and the soft chanting of priests whose daily rituals maintained the cosmic order upon which all life depended. The temple complex sprawled across acres of consecrated ground. Its halls and sanctuaries, connected by processional ways paved with granite and lined with sphinxes, whose enigmatic faces gazed eternally toward the rising sun. Yet it was not within the walls of Memphis itself that the most enduring monuments to pharaonic power would rise, but rather upon the high plateau that stretched westward from the city, where the life-giving valley met the realm of the dead. The Memphite necropolis, that vast city of the departed that would grow to encompass dozens of pyramid complexes and thousands of mastaba tombs, began to take shape during those foundational centuries of the Old Kingdom, transforming the desert landscape into a sacred geography that reflected the Egyptians' profound understanding of death as merely another form of life. The Pyramid Age began not with the towering perfection of the great monuments at Giza, but with the revolutionary vision of a pharaoh whose name would echo through eternity as the architect of immortality itself. Djoser, third king of the third dynasty, gazed upon the flat-topped mastaba tombs of his predecessors and dreamed of something unprecedented, something that would literally reach toward the heavens and proclaim his divine nature to all who looked upon it. Working in partnership with his brilliant architect Imhotep, a man whose genius would later earn him deification as a god of medicine and wisdom, Djoser commissioned the construction of what would become known as the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Rising in 6 distinct tiers from the desert floor, the Step Pyramid represented a revolution in both architectural technique and religious symbolism that would transform the very concept of royal burial for centuries to come. Each level of the pyramid seemed to climb toward the realm of the gods, creating a massive stone stairway upon which the pharaoh's spirit could ascend to take its rightful place among the imperishable stars. The monument stood not as a simple tomb, but as a cosmic machine designed to facilitate the transformation of the dead king into a divine being. Its interior chambers and passages reflecting the complex journey through the afterlife that every pharaoh must undertake to achieve eternal life. The construction of the Step Pyramid required the quarrying and transportation of over 330,000 tons of limestone, each block cut from the living rock of the desert and shaped by craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through generations of stoneworkers. The sound of copper chisels ringing against stone, of wooden levers groaning under massive weights, of thousands of workers chanting in rhythm as they hauled sledges loaded with building blocks, filled the air around Saqqara for years as the great monument slowly took shape. The very act of construction became a sacred ritual, a communal effort that bound the entire kingdom together in service to their divine ruler and his eternal destiny. Surrounding the Step Pyramid, Imhotep designed an entire funerary complex that recreated in stone the royal residence and administrative buildings of Memphis, ensuring that Djoser would have everything necessary for his continued rule in the afterlife. The complex was enclosed within a magnificent limestone wall that stretched for over a mile in perimeter, its surface decorated with intricate paneling that mimicked the reed and mud brick construction of earlier buildings, but rendered in eternal stone. Within these walls lay courtyards where the pharaoh's spirit could continue to celebrate the said festival, that ancient ceremony of royal renewal that ensured the king's continued vitality and divine favor. The symbolic power of the pyramid form proved so compelling that it quickly became the standard for royal burials throughout the Old Kingdom, evolving from Djoser's stepped monument toward the perfect geometric form that would achieve its ultimate expression in the monuments of the Fourth Dynasty. Each successive pharaoh sought to surpass his predecessors, not merely in size, but in the perfection of form, and the sophistication of the complex religious symbolism embedded within the structure. The pyramid became more than a tomb. It was a statement of divine authority, a geometric manifestation of the pharaoh's connection to Ra, the sun god whose daily journey across the sky provided the model for the king's own passage through death to eternal life. As the Pyramid Age reached its zenith, the necropolis at Giza emerged as the ultimate expression of pharaonic power and religious devotion, its three great pyramids rising from the desert like geometric mountains that seemed to have been placed there by the gods themselves. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built with mathematical precision that still astounds modern engineers, contained over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons and fitted together with such accuracy that a knife blade could not be inserted between the joints. The monument stood as a testament not only to the divine nature of the pharaoh, but to the extraordinary organizational capabilities of the Old Kingdom state, which could marshal the resources and labor necessary to complete such an undertaking. The Sphinx, that magnificent guardian of the Giza Plateau, with the body of a lion and the face of a king, gazed eternally eastward toward the rising sun, its weathered features bearing witness to the passage of millennia while maintaining its eternal vigil over the sacred landscape. Carved from a single outcrop of limestone, the Sphinx embodied the perfect fusion of human intelligence and divine power that the pharaohs claimed as their birthright, its massive form serving as both protector and symbol of the eternal nature of royal authority. The sacred landscape of Memphis and its associated necropolises created a geography of eternity that would endure long after the political power of the Old Kingdom had passed into history, its monuments continuing to proclaim the divine nature of pharaonic rule to all who witnessed their enduring majesty. Across the ancient landscape of Memphis, where the sacred and earthly realms converged in eternal dialogue, three names would echo through the millennia with a resonance that transcends mortal understanding: Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, pharaohs of the fourth dynasty, whose ambitions reached toward the heavens themselves, transforming a plateau of desert limestone into humanity's most enduring testament to divine kingship. These rulers, separated by decades, yet united in purpose, would orchestrate the construction of monuments so colossal that their shadows would stretch across 4,500 years of human history. The reign of Khufu marked the zenith of pyramid construction, a period when the resources of an entire civilization were marshaled in service of a single, overwhelming vision. Known to the Greeks as Cheops, this pharaoh commanded the construction of what would become known as the Great Pyramid, a structure of such mathematical precision and architectural audacity that it defied comprehension even among contemporary observers. Rising from the Giza Plateau with the inexorable certainty of a natural mountain, the pyramid stretched toward the sky in perfect geometric harmony, its base covering more than 13 acres of carefully leveled bedrock. The limestone blocks that formed its core, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons, were quarried from the very plateau upon which the pyramid stood, creating a vast excavation that would later house the Sphinx and countless smaller monuments. These stones, pale gold in the desert sun and silvery white beneath the moon, were cut with copper tools and wooden wedges, shaped by craftsmen whose names have vanished into the desert wind, but whose skill remains evident in every perfectly fitted joint. The outer casing, composed of brilliant white Tura limestone brought across the Nile from quarries to the east, created a surface so smooth and reflective that ancient writers described the completed pyramid as resembling a crystalline mountain, its faces catching and throwing back the light of Ra's solar bark as it traversed the heavens. Within this massive structure, corridors and chambers were carved with the precision of master jewelers working on a scale that dwarfed human comprehension. The Grand Gallery, rising at a steep angle through the pyramid's heart, stretched nearly 150 feet through the limestone core, its corbelled ceiling soaring 28 feet above a passage barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The walls, dressed in smooth granite and limestone, created acoustic properties that transformed every whispered word into something approaching the sacred, every footstep into a rhythmic invocation echoing through chambers where only pharaohs and gods were meant to tread. The king's chamber, positioned at the pyramid's mathematical center, housed a sarcophagus carved from a single block of red granite, its interior dimensions calculated to receive the mummified remains of the god King Khufu. The chamber itself, lined with the same deep red granite brought from quarries near Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south, created an environment of profound stillness, broken only by the almost imperceptible settling of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above. Here, in darkness absolute, save for the flickering light of oil lamps, the pharaoh's eternal form would rest, surrounded by the mathematical perfection of divine architecture. The construction of this monument required not merely the labor of countless workers, but the coordination of an administrative apparatus of staggering complexity. Gangs of laborers, identified by names carved into hidden stones, friends of Khufu, and drunkards of Menkore, worked in rotating shifts that lasted months at a time. These men, far from the slaves of popular imagination, were skilled craftsmen and seasonal workers drawn from across Egypt, fed on bread, beer, and meat, housed in carefully planned settlements that archaeologists continue to uncover along the plateau's edges. When Khafre ascended to the throne, perhaps as Khufu's son, the Great Pyramid already dominated the Giza Plateau like a man-made mountain. Yet Khafre's vision encompassed not merely the continuation of his predecessor's work, but its completion through architectural dialogue. His pyramid, rising to a height nearly equal to Khufu's, through the simple expedient of being built on higher ground, created a visual conversation between the monuments, their limestone faces reflecting light back and forth across the desert, in an eternal interplay of shadow and brilliance. Khafre's pyramid retained much of its original casing stones at the apex, creating a distinctive silhouette that caught the light differently throughout the day, its polished surface gleaming like burnished metal against the deep blue of the desert sky. The internal passages, while following the same general principles as those of the Great Pyramid, incorporated refinements and modifications that spoke to the accumulated knowledge of a generation of master builders. The burial chamber, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, created an environment of profound underground stillness, where the weight of the monument above seemed to press eternity itself into the carefully dressed stone. Yet Khafre's most enduring contribution to the Giza complex emerged not from pyramid construction, but from the transformation of a natural limestone outcropping into the most enigmatic sculpture in human history. The Great Sphinx, carved from the living rock, left behind by the construction of his father's pyramid, merged the pharaoh's human head with the powerful body of a lion, creating a creature that gazed eastward toward the rising sun with an expression of eternal vigilance. This monument, emerging from the desert floor as if the earth itself had given birth to divine consciousness, would eventually become buried to its neck in sand, creating for medieval observers the illusion of a head emerging from the depths of time itself. Menkore, inheriting this landscape of divine architecture, chose to complete the triad through a pyramid of more modest proportions, yet no less perfect execution. His monument, rising to barely half the height of its companions, demonstrated that grandeur lay not merely in scale, but in proportion and harmony. The granite casing that covered the lower courses created a visual anchor for the entire complex, its dark stone providing a counterpoint to the brilliant limestone of the larger pyramids, while maintaining the mathematical relationships that governed the entire sacred landscape. The internal chambers of Menkore's pyramid, though smaller in scale, exhibited refinements in construction technique that represented the culmination of nearly a century of pyramid building expertise. The burial chamber, lined with carefully fitted granite blocks, created an environment of profound acoustic isolation, where sound seemed to die immediately upon utterance, as if the stone itself absorbed all vibration and held it in eternal silence. The sarcophagus, carved with a precision that made the granite appear almost soft, bore decorations of palace facade designs that connected the pharaoh's eternal rest with the earthly architecture of divine kingship. Together, these three monuments created a landscape that transformed the natural world into something approaching divine architecture, their mathematical relationships reflecting the cosmic order that ancient Egyptians perceived underlying all existence. The pyramids' orientations, aligned with cardinal directions to a precision that modern instruments can barely improve upon, created a terrestrial mirror of celestial perfection. Their internal passages, positioned to align with specific stars and constellations, transformed the monuments into astronomical instruments of unimaginable sophistication, machines designed to facilitate the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife and their eventual reunion with the sun god Ra. The shadows cast by these monuments moved across the plateau with the measured precision of sundials, creating patterns of light and darkness that marked not merely the passage of hours, but the eternal cycles of death and rebirth that governed Egyptian cosmology. At dawn, the eastern faces blazed with reflected sunlight, while the western faces disappeared into purple shadow. At sunset, the positions reversed, creating a daily rhythm that connected the monuments to the fundamental movements of the cosmos itself, ensuring that even in their eternal stillness, they participated in the great dance of creation that ancient Egyptians saw playing out across the heavens above the Nile. The shadows of the Great Pyramids stretched long across the desert sands as another day began along the eternal Nile, where the rhythm of life had flowed unchanged for countless generations since the time of Khufu and his successors. Far from the monumental silence of Giza, the river itself pulsed with a different kind of energy, carrying within its muddy waters the lifeblood of an entire civilization that had learned to dance with the annual floods and embrace the predictable cycles of abundance and scarcity. In the pre-dawn darkness, before Ra's golden bark emerged from the underworld to begin its daily journey across the heavens, the first stirrings of human activity began along the riverbanks, where papyrus reeds swayed gently in the morning breeze. Fishermen pushed their simple reed boats into the dark waters, their movements practiced and economical, disturbing barely a ripple as they glided between the lotus blossoms that floated like scattered stars across the river's surface. The air hung thick with moisture and the rich scent of fertile silt, that black gold which the ancients called the gift of the Nile, and which would soon transform the barren floodplains into emerald fields of barley and emmer wheat. As the eastern horizon began to blush with the faintest hint of dawn, the sound of wooden mallets against stone echoed from the workshops where craftsmen had already begun their daily labor, shaping limestone blocks and carving intricate hieroglyphs that would one day adorn the tombs of nobles and the temples of gods. The rhythmic hammering created a percussion that seemed to harmonize with the gentle lapping of water against the muddy banks. Where sacred ibises stood motionless among the reeds, their white plumage stark against the deep green of the papyrus thickets. These birds, sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom, appeared to contemplate the eternal mysteries as they waited patiently for fish to swim within range of their curved beaks. The first golden rays of sunlight struck the waters of the Nile just as the fishermen began to haul in their nets, heavy with the night's catch of perch and catfish that would feed the growing populations of the river cities. Steam rose from the warming surface of the river, creating a gossamer veil that softened the harsh lines of the distant cliffs and made the entire landscape appear dreamlike and ethereal. Along the eastern bank, where the sun's rays first touched the earth, farmers emerged from their mud-brick houses with wooden hoes and copper-bladed sickles, ready to tend the fields that stretched in green ribbons between the life-giving river and the encroaching desert sands. The annual flood had receded months ago, leaving behind its precious cargo of fertile silt that now nurtured crops tall enough to sway in the morning breeze like a verdant sea. Irrigation canals crisscrossed the landscape in an intricate network of waterways that the ancient engineers had perfected over generations, channeling the river's bounty to even the most distant fields where barley grew in neat rows and flax plants prepared to yield their fibers for the looms of skilled weavers. Children ran between the furrows, their laughter mixing with the calls of hoopoes and the distant lowing of cattle being driven to graze along the marshy edges of the floodplain. As Ra climbed higher into the azure sky, the tempo of life along the river quickened, without ever losing its essential rhythm. Cargo boats, heavy with granite blocks from the southern quarries, moved slowly downstream, their crews chanting work songs that had been passed down through generations of Nile boatmen, the words worn smooth by constant repetition, like stones polished by the river's eternal flow. These vessels, with their characteristic curved prows and square-rigged sails, carried not only building materials, but also precious goods from Nubia, gold that gleamed like captured sunlight, ivory white as moonbeams, and exotic hardwoods that would be crafted into furniture for the palaces of pharaohs and the homes of wealthy merchants. The marketplaces that lined the riverfront came alive with the voices of traders haggling over prices, their animated gestures creating a ballet of commerce that played out beneath colourful awnings stretched between wooden posts. Pottery jars filled with grain stood in neat rows beside baskets overflowing with dates and figs, while bolts of fine linen lay folded in precise stacks that demonstrated the skill of the weavers who had transformed humble flax into fabric fit for kings. The air filled with the mingled aromas of baking bread, roasting meat, and the sweet perfume of lotus blossoms that vendors sold to women who would wear them in their elaborately braided hair. In the workshops that lined the riverbank, artisans pursued their crafts with the same dedication that their ancestors had shown when creating treasures for the pyramid builders of Giza. Goldsmiths worked tiny sheets of precious metal with bone tools, creating jewelry that caught and reflected the dancing light that filtered through reed screens covering their windows. Stone carvers shaped vessels from alabaster and diorite, their copper chisels ringing against the hard stone, as they created works of art that would grace the homes of nobles and the temples of gods for millennia to come. The steady rhythm of their work created a symphony of productivity that rose and fell with the movement of the sun across the sky. As the day reached its zenith, and Ra's chariot blazed directly overhead, casting sharp shadows that offered blessed relief from the intensity of the desert sun. The pace of activity along the Nile shifted into a more contemplative mode. Workers sought shade beneath the broad leaves of sycamore trees that grew along the riverbank, their branches heavy with sweet fruit that had sustained travelers and laborers since time immemorial. The river itself seemed to slow its eternal flow, becoming a mirror that reflected the perfect blue of the cloudless sky and the graceful forms of herons wading through the shallow waters near the shore. Women gathered at the river's edge to wash clothing and fill water jars, their movements graceful and economical as they worked in small groups, sharing news and gossip, while their children played safely nearby under the watchful eyes of the community. The sound of their voices, blended with the gentle splashing of water and the rustling of papyrus reeds, to create a peaceful symphony that spoke of social harmony and the comfort that comes from living in rhythm with the natural world. Brightly coloured fabrics spread on the grass to dry, created patches of blue and red and yellow that seemed to capture fragments of the sky and hold them against the earth. The afternoon brought its own particular magic, as the angle of the sun transformed the colour of the river from deep blue to burnished bronze, and the limestone cliffs that bordered the valley began to glow with warm, honey-coloured light. Scribes emerged from the temples and administrative buildings, where they had spent the morning hours recording grain deliveries and tax assessments. Their reed pens and pallets tucked safely in leather satchels as they walked slowly along the riverbank, perhaps contemplating the wisdom contained in the sacred texts they had copied or composed during their hours of careful labour. As evening approached and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, where it would enter the realm of the dead before being reborn the following dawn, the entire landscape along the Nile seemed to exhale softly, releasing the heat and energy of the day into the cooling air. Ibises returned to their roosting places among the papyrus thickets, their wings creating gentle disturbances in the still air as they settled for the night. Fishing boats began their journey back to shore, their holds filled with the day's catch, and their crews singing ancient songs that honoured both the river that sustained them and the gods who governed its eternal flow, from the distant cataracts in the south to the mysterious delta lands in the far north, where the sacred waters finally merged with the great green sea. The sacred rhythms of the Nile that governed the lives of common folk found their ultimate expression in the person of the pharaoh, that divine bridge between the mortal realm and the eternal cosmos. As the sun climbed higher each day over the fertile valley, casting its golden light across temple walls and palace courtyards, the god-king began his own elaborate dance with the divine forces that sustained all existence. The pharaoh's awakening was not merely the stirring of a mortal ruler, but the daily renewal of cosmic order itself, a moment when divine consciousness descended once more into earthly form to shepherd the kingdom through another cycle of sacred time. Within the cool stone chambers of the royal palace, priests moved with silent precision through the pre-dawn darkness, preparing the sacred oils and linens that would transform the sleeping monarch into the living embodiment of divine authority. The air hung heavy with frankincense and myrrh, precious resins that carried prayers upward to the realm of the gods, while golden lamplight flickered across hieroglyphic inscriptions that proclaimed the pharaoh's eternal nature. These morning rituals unfolded with the same inevitability as sunrise itself. Each gesture and incantation part of an ancient choreography designed to maintain the delicate balance between heaven and earth. The pharaoh's first duty each dawn was the performance of the sacred toilet, a complex ceremony that saw the divine ruler purified and adorned with the symbols of kingship. Skilled attendants bathed the royal form in water drawn from the sacred Nile, that life-giving stream whose floods mirrored the tears of Isis and whose currents carried the blessing of the gods throughout the land. The ceremonial washing removed not merely the dust of sleep, but any spiritual impurities that might have accumulated during the vulnerable hours of darkness when the soul traveled through the realm of dreams, and the pharaoh's divine essence rested temporarily dormant. Layer upon layer of the finest linen wrapped the pharaoh's form, each fold blessed by priestly hands and imbued with protective spells that would guard the divine ruler throughout the day's sacred obligations. The royal crowns, the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, or the combined double crown that symbolized dominion over the entire valley, were placed upon the pharaoh's head with reverent ceremony, their ancient forms carrying within them the accumulated power of countless generations of divine kings. The golden crook and flail, symbols of the shepherd king who guided his people with wisdom and protected them with strength, completed the transformation from mortal flesh to living deity. Thus prepared, the pharaoh emerged from the palace as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, beginning a daily round of ceremonies and rituals that would ensure the continued favor of the gods and the preservation of Ma'at, that fundamental principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice that underpinned all existence. The royal progress through the palace complex and temple precincts unfolded like a stately river, carrying in its wake courtiers, priests, and officials whose own lives found meaning and purpose in service to the divine monarch. The morning's first destination was invariably the temple of the patron deity, where the pharaoh would perform the sacred ritual of awakening the god statue. Offering food and drink to sustain the divine essence housed within the golden form. The pharaoh's hands, believed to channel divine power, would break the clay seals that protected the shrine during the dangerous hours of night, opening the sanctuary to receive the blessing of daylight and the sustenance of human devotion. Clouds of incense rose from golden braziers as the god-king presented offerings of bread, beer, meat, and vegetables, feeding the deity's ka while ensuring the continued flow of divine benevolence toward the kingdom. These temple ceremonies extended far beyond mere ritual obligations, representing instead the pharaoh's role as the sole intermediary between the divine and mortal realms, the only human worthy to stand in the presence of the gods as an equal. Within the temple's innermost sanctuary, where ordinary mortals feared to tread, the pharaoh communed with forces that controlled the flooding of the Nile, the movement of the stars, and the fundamental structures of reality itself. The hieroglyphic texts that covered every surface spoke of divine conversations, of the gods sharing their wisdom with their earthly representative, and receiving in return the devotion and service of the entire kingdom. The maintenance of Ma'at required more than temple rituals and divine communion. extending into every aspect of governance and daily administration. As the morning progressed, the pharaoh moved from sacred space to royal court, where the divine nature of kingship manifested in the dispensation of justice and the resolution of conflicts that threatened the harmony of the realm. Seated upon the golden throne beneath a canopy that reproduced the star-spangled sky of night, the pharaoh received petitioners and heard cases that had been brought before the royal presence, each judgment reflecting the cosmic principle of truth and righteousness that the god-king was sworn to uphold. The pharaoh's words carried the weight of divine authority, transforming spoken decisions into immutable law that governed the lives of millions throughout the kingdom. Scribes recorded each royal pronouncement on papyrus scrolls that would be copied and distributed throughout the administrative centers of the realm, carrying the pharaoh's divine will to the farthest reaches of Egyptian civilization. The very act of royal speech was understood as a creative force, similar to the divine utterances that brought the world into existence during the first moments of creation. Each royal decree adding to the complex tapestry of law and custom that maintained order throughout the land. The afternoon hours brought different sacred obligations, as the pharaoh participated in rituals designed to ensure the continued fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. During the crucial period of the Nile's annual flood, the god-king performed ceremonies that were believed to influence the height and timing of the life-giving waters, casting ritual offerings into the current, while pronouncing ancient formulas that had been passed down through generations of divine rulers. The pharaoh's connection to the natural cycles that governed Egyptian life extended to the agricultural calendar itself, with royal ceremonies marking the proper times for planting, harvesting, and storing the grain that sustained the kingdom through times of plenty and scarcity. Special festivals throughout the year required the pharaoh's active participation in elaborate public ceremonies that demonstrated the divine nature of kingship to the assembled masses. During the Opet festival, when the statue of Amun travelled from Karnak to Luxor in a magnificent procession, the pharaoh walked beside the god's sacred bark, sharing in the divine journey while renewing the cosmic bonds that sustained royal authority. These public appearances served multiple purposes, reinforcing the pharaoh's divine status in the minds of the people, while providing opportunities for the god-king to demonstrate the prosperity and stability that divine rule brought to the kingdom. The evening hours saw the pharaoh return once more to the sacred precincts, participating in rituals designed to ensure the successful passage of the sun god Re through the dangerous underworld during the night hours ahead. As shadows lengthened across temple courtyards and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the pharaoh offered prayers and sacrifices intended to strengthen the solar deity for his nightly battle against the forces of chaos and destruction. These evening ceremonies carried particular significance, as the pharaoh's own divine essence was understood to participate in the cosmic struggle that played out each night in the realm beyond mortal perception. The day's final ritual saw the pharaoh retiring to the palace sanctuary, where the royal car would rest until dawn brought another opportunity to serve as the divine intermediary between heaven and earth. Even in sleep, the pharaoh's sacred duties continued, as the royal spirit was believed to travel through the realm of the gods, receiving divine guidance and inspiration that would inform the following day's decisions and actions. The pharaoh's dreams were understood as messages from the divine realm, prophetic visions that might reveal threats to the kingdom or opportunities for expanding Egyptian power and influence throughout the known world. Thus, the pharaoh's existence unfolded in an endless cycle of sacred obligation and divine communion, each day bringing fresh opportunities to maintain the cosmic order that sustained Egyptian civilization. The god-king's earthly duties extended far beyond temporal governance, encompassing responsibility for the very fabric of reality itself, ensuring that Ma'at continued to prevail over the forces of chaos and disorder that perpetually threatened to overwhelm the ordered world that the gods had created and entrusted to pharaonic care. The sacred duties that bound the pharaoh to the mortal realm during life extended far beyond the threshold of death, weaving into an intricate tapestry of beliefs that transformed the end of earthly existence into the beginning of an eternal journey. In the shadow of the Great Pyramids, where the desert winds whispered secrets across millennia of sand, the ancient Egyptians developed the most elaborate and sophisticated understanding of death and the afterlife that the world has ever known. Their burial practices were not mere ceremonies of farewell, but complex rituals of transformation, designed to ensure that the divine essence of the pharaoh would continue to shine like the eternal sun across the celestial waters of eternity. Within the sacred chambers, where embalmers worked their ancient craft, the preservation of the royal body became an act of profound spiritual significance. The process of mummification stretched across 70 days, each stage carefully orchestrated according to rituals that had been refined over countless generations. In workshops filled with the aromatic smoke of burning incense and the sharp scent of natron salt, skilled artisans removed the organs with instruments of bronze and obsidian, their movements guided by prayers that had been whispered over the dead for thousands of years. The brain was drawn out through the nasal passages with delicate hooks, while the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were carefully extracted and placed in canopic jars, each protected by one of the four sons of Horus. The body was then packed in natron, that miraculous salt that drew moisture from flesh while preserving its essential form, creating a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the eternal. For weeks, the royal remains lay in this crystalline embrace, slowly transforming from mortal flesh into something approaching the incorruptible substance of the gods themselves. When the process was complete, the mummified pharaoh was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, each layer accompanied by amulets and charms designed to protect the soul during its perilous journey through the underworld. Gold leaf was applied to the fingers and toes, while precious stones were placed over the eyes, transforming the dead ruler into a gleaming avatar of divine power. The completed mummy was then encased in a series of nested coffins, each more magnificent than the last, until finally it rested within a sarcophagus carved from the finest granite or quartzite. These stone vessels were not mere containers, but cosmic maps, their surfaces decorated with star charts and religious texts that would guide the deceased through the celestial realm. The innermost coffin, often fashioned from solid gold or wood covered in gold leaf, bore the idealized features of the pharaoh, capturing not the worn face of mortality, but the perfected countenance of divinity. Every detail was carved with exquisite precision, from the false beard of kingship to the cobra and vulture emblems that proclaimed eternal sovereignty over Upper and Lower Egypt. The journey to the afterlife began the moment death claimed the royal spirit, launching the pharaoh's ka, or life force, into a realm where geography was measured in spiritual rather than physical distances. According to the ancient texts inscribed on pyramid walls and papyrus scrolls, the deceased ruler first had to navigate the dangerous passages of the Duat, the underworld that stretched beneath the earth like a vast cavern filled with rivers of fire and lakes of shadow. Here dwelt creatures of unimaginable terror, serpents whose coils could crush the unwary soul, and demons whose very gaze could reduce a spirit to nothingness. The pharaoh's ba, the aspect of the soul that retained individual personality and memory, would take the form of a human-headed bird, capable of flying between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This magnificent creature, with feathers that shimmered like gold in the eternal twilight of the afterlife, carried within it all the experiences, knowledge, and divine power that the ruler had accumulated during earthly existence. The ba could return to visit the mummified body, drawing sustenance from the elaborate tomb paintings that depicted scenes of daily life, ensuring that the connection between flesh and spirit remained unbroken throughout eternity. Deep within the burial chamber, surrounded by walls covered in hieroglyphic texts that served as a guide through the afterlife, the pharaoh's mummy was accompanied by an astonishing array of grave goods. Golden jewelry glittered in the darkness, while precious vessels held oils and perfumes that would never lose their fragrance. Furniture of ebony and ivory stood ready to serve the deceased in the next world, while chests filled with clothing ensured that the pharaoh would be appropriately attired for any occasion in the eternal realm. Model boats, complete with crews of servant figures, waited to carry the royal spirit across the celestial waters, while granaries filled with miniature loaves guaranteed that hunger would never trouble the divine traveller. The most critical moment in the afterlife journey occurred in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. This cosmic courtroom, presided over by Osiris himself, determined whether the pharaoh was worthy of eternal life or would be devoured by Ammit, the terrifying creature with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. The heart, considered the seat of intelligence and moral character, had to be lighter than the feather, proving that the ruler had lived according to the principles of Ma'at and deserved to join the imperishable stars. If the weighing proved favourable, the pharaoh's spirit would be granted access to the Field of Reeds, an idealized version of the Nile Valley where the blessed dead spent eternity. In this paradise, grain grew to impossible heights, the harvest was perpetual, and the Nile floods came precisely when needed, without the unpredictability that marked earthly existence. Here, the pharaoh would continue to rule, not over mortal subjects, but over the other blessed dead, maintaining order in the afterlife, just as divine kingship had maintained Ma'at in the world of the living. The preservation of the pharaoh's name and image was considered as crucial as the preservation of the physical body, for in Egyptian belief, to be forgotten was to die a second and final death. Tomb walls were covered with inscriptions proclaiming the ruler's great deeds, while statues captured the royal likeness for all eternity. These images served as anchors for the deceased pharaoh's ka, providing focal points where offerings could be made and prayers recited. The elaborate mortuary temples built adjacent to royal tombs functioned as eternal machines of remembrance, where priests would perform daily rituals to sustain the pharaoh's spirit throughout the endless cycles of cosmic time. The most spectacular expression of these beliefs reached its zenith during the Fourth Dynasty, when pharaohs like Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure constructed the Great Pyramids of Giza, monuments that transformed the entire landscape into a sacred geography of the afterlife. These colossal structures, built from millions of precisely cut limestone blocks, rose from the desert like artificial mountains, their smooth sides reflecting the sun's rays, and serving as staircases to heaven. Within their shadowy chambers, accessed through passages so narrow that mourners had to crawl on hands and knees, the pharaohs lay surrounded by the accumulated treasures of their reigns, waiting for resurrection in the imperishable realm beyond the stars. The pyramid complexes extended far beyond the burial chambers themselves, encompassing causeway temples where the pharaoh's body was received and prepared for its final journey, valley temples where purification rituals were performed, and smaller pyramids for royal wives and family members. These vast installations required armies of priests to maintain them, creating economic systems that could sustain elaborate rituals for centuries after the pharaoh's death. The revenues from vast estates, worked by thousands of peasants, flowed into these mortuary institutions, ensuring that bread, beer, and meat would be offered daily to sustain the royal spirit in its eternal dwelling place. As the Old Kingdom reached its magnificent height, these burial practices became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating new spells and rituals designed to enhance the pharaoh's power in the afterlife. The pyramid texts, carved into the walls of royal burial chambers, beginning with the pharaoh Unas, represented the world's oldest religious literature, preserving magical formulas and cosmic knowledge that stretched back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. These hieroglyphic inscriptions transformed the tomb into a three-dimensional book of the dead, where every wall surface served as a page in the ultimate manual for navigating eternity, ensuring that the divine pharaoh would reign forever in the imperishable kingdom beyond the western horizon, where the sun completed its daily journey through the underworld. Beyond the sealed chambers, where pharaohs began their eternal journey, the great pyramid complexes hummed with the quiet industry of those who served the divine order. The scribes arrived each morning as the first light touched the limestone walls, their reed pens and palettes carefully arranged, their minds already focused on the sacred duty of recording and preserving the kingdom's endless transactions with eternity. These men moved through the temple corridors with practiced reverence, their white linen kilts rustling softly against the polished stone floors, their bare feet finding familiar pathways worn smooth by generations of their predecessors. In the House of Life, the temple's scriptorium, rows of scribes bent over their work in comfortable silence, their brushes dancing across papyrus with the fluid grace of long experience. The air carried the subtle fragrance of fresh ink mixed with ground minerals, the earthy scent of papyrus reeds, and the faint smokiness of oil lamps that burned even in daylight to supplement the carefully positioned windows. Each scribe commanded a vast repertoire of hieroglyphic symbols, nearly 700 sacred signs that could capture every nuance of meaning, from the mundane records of grain deliveries to the most profound theological concepts that governed the pharaoh's divine nature. The senior scribes, distinguished by their fine jewelry and the quality of their writing materials, supervised the creation of the great mortuary texts that would guide the deceased pharaoh through the underworld's challenges. Their fingers, stained permanently with ink, moved with meditative precision as they copied the ancient formulas onto fresh papyrus, each symbol placed with mathematical accuracy according to traditions stretching back to the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. The younger apprentices watched intently, memorizing not just the shapes of the hieroglyphs, but their deeper meanings, the subtle variations that could alter a spell's power, the precise measurements that ensured each text would function perfectly in the realm of the dead. Within the temple's inner sanctuaries, the priests maintained their own eternal rhythm, their days structured around the complex rituals that sustained the pharaoh's ka in the afterlife. These men had undergone years of purification and training, learning the intricate ceremonies that transformed ordinary offerings into spiritual nourishment for the royal soul. They bathed multiple times each day in the sacred pool, their bodies cleansed not merely of physical impurity, but of any spiritual contamination that might compromise their sacred duties. Their white linen garments, woven from flax grown in temple fields and bleached to perfect purity, represented their role as intermediaries between the earthly and divine realms. The high priest, his scalp shaved smooth and gleaming with sacred oils, approached the pharaoh's cult statue in the temple's most sacred chamber, just as his predecessors had done for countless generations. The morning ritual unfolded with clockwork precision, the breaking of the clay seal that protected the god overnight, the gentle awakening of the divine presence with soft chants, the ceremonial clothing of the statue in fresh linens, and the presentation of the morning meal. The priests moved through these actions with absolute concentration, knowing that any mistake could disrupt the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous and secure under the pharaoh's eternal protection. In the workshops that surrounded the pyramid complex, master craftsmen guided their apprentices through the creation of objects that would serve the pharaoh's needs throughout eternity. The air in these spaces thrummed with purposeful activity, the steady percussion of copper chisels against granite, the soft whisper of fine sandpaper smoothing wooden surfaces, the gentle clink of gold being hammered into delicate sheets. Master carpenters, their hands weathered and skilled from decades of practice, shaped cedar and ebony imported from distant lands into furniture fit for divine use. Their apprentices learned not just the technical aspects of their craft, but its spiritual dimensions, understanding how each joint and curve contributed to objects that must function perfectly in the realm of the gods. The sculptors worked in a different kind of meditation, their chisels gradually revealing the eternal forms hidden within blocks of stone. These artists had trained for years to master the canonical proportions that governed Egyptian art. Learning to see beyond individual features to capture the essence of divine kingship itself. The sound of their tools against stone created a rhythm that seemed to echo through the ages, each careful strike removing another fragment of impermanence to reveal the timeless beneath. Their workshops smelled of stone dust and the oils they used to preserve their tools, while the floors accumulated layers of granite chips and limestone powder, that crunched softly underfoot. Goldsmiths laboured in smaller chambers where security could be maintained over the precious materials they transformed into objects of incredible beauty and spiritual power. The soft yellow light of their oil lamps played across sheets of electrum and pure gold, metals that the Egyptians associated with the flesh of the gods themselves. These craftsmen had developed techniques of extraordinary sophistication, creating granulation so fine it appeared to be golden sand, and achieving joins so seamless that finished pieces seemed to have emerged complete from the earth. Their small hammers created a gentle, almost musical percussion as they shaped the eternal metal into forms that would accompany the pharaoh on his cosmic journey. The painters who decorated tomb walls and temple chambers possessed perhaps the most complex skills of all, combining artistic mastery with deep theological knowledge. They understood not merely how to create beautiful images, but how to charge those images with the spiritual power necessary to ensure their eternal function. Their pigments came from across the known world. Blue from lapis lazuli, carried by traders across vast deserts. Red from ochre mined in Upper Egypt's quarries. Black from charcoal and soot. White from limestone, carefully ground and purified. Each colour carried symbolic meaning, and the painters mixed their materials with water drawn from sacred wells, creating paints that bridged the physical and spiritual worlds. These artists worked by lamplight in the confined spaces of tomb chambers, their movements careful and deliberate as they applied each brushstroke according to patterns refined over centuries. The walls gradually came alive under their patient work, populated with scenes of the pharaoh's triumph in the afterlife, his successful navigation of the underworld's challenges, and his eternal union with the sun god Ra. Every figure was painted according to strict conventions that ensured its spiritual effectiveness. Profiles for maximum recognition by the gods, colours that enhanced magical properties, proportions that reflected divine perfection rather than mere human accuracy. The textile workers, mostly women supervised by experienced masters, created the linens that would wrap the pharaoh's body and clothe the priests who served his cult. Their looms sang with the steady rhythm of warp and weft, producing fabrics so fine they seemed to capture light itself within their weave. The thread they used came from flax grown in temple fields, processed according to ancient techniques that removed every impurity and spun to a fineness that required extraordinary skill to achieve. These women understood that their work served purposes beyond mere clothing. The quality and purity of their linen would directly affect the pharaoh's ability to achieve successful transformation in the afterlife. In the perfume workshops, master chemists blended the aromatic resins and oils that would preserve the royal body and create the pleasant fragrances that attracted beneficial spirits while repelling harmful entities from the tomb. Cedar oil from Lebanon, frankincense from Punt, myrrh from Somalia, and dozens of other precious materials were combined according to secret formulas passed down through generations of specialized craftsmen. These men worked surrounded by the intense fragrances of their trade, their senses trained to detect the subtle differences that separated an adequate preservation mixture from one capable of maintaining a body's integrity throughout eternity. All these skilled individuals understood their roles within the greater cosmic order that centered on the pharaoh's divine nature and eternal needs. Their workshops and studios hummed with quiet purpose as they contributed their specialized knowledge to the vast project of ensuring the king's successful transition to godhood. The scribes recorded and preserved, the priests maintained and purified, the craftsmen created and perfected, all working together to sustain the complex machinery of divine kingship that protected Egypt and maintained the cosmic order for generations, stretching endlessly into the future. Their combined efforts weaving the earthly and eternal into a seamless whole that would endure as long as the pyramids themselves stood sentinel over the sacred landscape of Giza. The scribes bent over their papyrus scrolls in the royal workshops, their reed brushes moving with practiced precision across surfaces that would carry the pharaoh's decrees to distant provinces. Yet, beneath the steady rhythm of their work lay an almost imperceptible tremor of uncertainty. The great stone chambers where they laboured had witnessed centuries of unwavering routine, where each hieroglyphic symbol was placed with the confidence of eternal order. But now, the very air seemed to carry whispers of transformation that would not be silenced. These master craftsmen of language and record-keeping, who had once chronicled the construction of monuments that seemed to touch the heavens themselves, found their styluses hesitating over documents that spoke of provinces growing restless, of harvests that failed to meet the palace's expectations, and of nobles in distant cities who questioned the divine authority that had once been absolute. The golden afternoon light that filtered through the high windows of the palace archives illuminated dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above scrolls containing reports from the furthest reaches of the kingdom. Regional governors, once content to serve as faithful extensions of pharaonic will, began to speak in council chambers with voices that carried subtle notes of independence. Their words carefully chosen, but unmistakably different from the unquestioning deference that had characterized earlier generations. The great administrative machinery that had functioned with clockwork precision for centuries began to show signs of strain, not through any dramatic collapse, but through the gradual accumulation of small delays, minor disputes over taxation, and the increasingly common sight of messengers returning from distant nomes with reports of local officials who claimed the right to make decisions without waiting for royal approval. In the shadow of the Great Pyramids, where the eternal presence of past pharaohs had once provided unshakable assurance of divine continuity, the current rulers found themselves grappling with challenges that seemed to emerge not from external enemies or natural disasters, but from the very success of their predecessors. The elaborate bureaucracy that had been created to manage an empire of unprecedented complexity had grown so sophisticated that it began to develop its own centers of power, its own networks of loyalty, its own subtle resistance to change. Provincial temples, grown wealthy through centuries of royal patronage, housed priests who spoke increasingly of local gods and local concerns. Their morning rituals, now including prayers that seemed to petition divine powers beyond the pharaoh's direct influence. The artisans, who had carved the magnificent reliefs celebrating pharaonic victories and divine communion, continued their work in the royal workshops, but their chisels now shaped stone that would decorate monuments of more modest scale, reflecting not any diminishment of skill or devotion, but rather a gradual shift in the kingdom's priorities and resources. The great quarries that had once thundered with the sound of thousands of workers extracting limestone and granite for pyramids now operated with smaller crews, their efforts directed toward maintaining existing structures rather than creating new wonders that would dwarf all previous achievements. Master sculptors, whose fathers and grandfathers had perfected the art of capturing divine majesty in stone, found themselves adapting their techniques to commemorate pharaohs whose reigns were marked more by administrative reform than by conquests or architectural marvels. The rhythm of palace life itself began to change in ways that would have been almost imperceptible to casual observers, but which reflected fundamental shifts in the nature of royal authority. Court ceremonies that had once drawn hundreds of officials and foreign dignitaries now attracted smaller, more intimate gatherings, not from any lack of respect for pharaonic dignity, but because the kingdom's energy was increasingly focused on the practical challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances. Royal audience halls, which had echoed with the formal proclamations of absolute power, now hosted longer, more complex discussions about tax collection, irrigation maintenance, and the delicate negotiations required to maintain loyalty among provincial elites who possessed their own resources and their own ambitions. The sacred barges that had once carried pharaohs along the Nile, in processions of unparalleled splendor, still glided across the eternal river, their golden ornaments catching the sun with the same divine radiance. But their journeys now served purposes that were as much diplomatic as ceremonial. These floating palaces became venues for careful conversations with regional leaders, spaces where the traditional rituals of pharaonic authority blended with the newer necessities of consultation and compromise. The priests who accompanied these royal progresses found themselves serving not only as guardians of ancient protocols, but as mediators between the timeless claims of divine kingship and the evolving expectations of subjects who had grown sophisticated in their understanding of governance and their confidence in expressing local interests. Ancient trade routes that had carried exotic goods and tribute to the pharaohs' storehouses continued to pulse with commercial activity. But the flow of wealth began to distribute itself more evenly throughout the kingdom, creating centers of prosperity that no longer depended entirely on royal favor for their existence. Merchants who had once measured their success solely by their access to palace contracts now developed independent networks that stretched beyond Egypt's borders, bringing new ideas and new perspectives that filtered through society like water through fertile soil. The great state workshops, while still producing magnificent artifacts for royal use, increasingly found themselves competing with provincial craftsmen whose skills had reached levels that challenged the monopoly once held by palace artisans. The priests who maintained the elaborate religious ceremonies that had always formed the foundation of pharaonic legitimacy continued their ancient rituals with unwavering devotion. Yet even within the sacred precincts of the temples, subtle changes reflected the kingdom's gradual transformation. Local deities, which had previously been understood as aspects or servants of the great gods, associated with pharaonic power, began to attract devotion that emphasized their particular connection to specific regions and communities. Temple libraries, repositories of wisdom that had once focused entirely on preserving and interpreting royal religious traditions, increasingly included texts that explored theological questions from perspectives that did not automatically defer to pharaonic interpretation. The scribal schools that had long served as training grounds for future administrators began to produce graduates whose skills and perspectives reflected the changing needs of a kingdom where power was becoming more distributed and where effective governance required not just obedience to central authority, but also the ability to understand and respond to local conditions. These young men, educated in the same classical traditions that had shaped their predecessors, carried their learning into positions where they found themselves navigating between loyalty to pharaonic ideals and responsiveness to the practical demands of communities that had developed their own sense of identity and purpose. As the seasons turned and the Nile continued its eternal cycle of flood and recession, the Old Kingdom did not collapse in any dramatic fashion, but rather underwent a gradual metamorphosis that would eventually give birth to new forms of Egyptian civilization. The great achievements of the pyramid builders remained as monuments to human ambition and divine inspiration, while the kingdom itself evolved into something more complex, more diverse, and perhaps more resilient than the centralized state that had created those timeless wonders. In the gentle evening light that painted the western desert in shades of gold and purple, the eternal monuments stood as witnesses to both the glory of what had been accomplished and the inevitability of change that would carry their civilization forward into new chapters of its magnificent story. The whispers of change that had begun to stir through the corridors of Memphis found their most profound expression in the gradual transformation of Egypt's provincial structure, where a quiet revolution was reshaping the very foundations of pharaonic power. In the distant provinces, far from the towering monuments and bustling administrative centers of the capital, a new class of officials was emerging from the shadows of royal authority, their influence growing like the slow but inexorable rise of the Nile's annual flood. These were the nomarchs, the provincial governors who had once served as mere extensions of the pharaoh's will, dutiful administrators whose loyalty was assumed as naturally as the rising of the sun over the eastern desert. The transformation began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the first hairline cracks that appear in ancient stone before the monument itself begins to crumble. During the Fourth Dynasty, when the Great Pyramids cast their eternal shadows across the Memphite necropolis, provincial governors had been appointed directly by the pharaoh, chosen from among the royal family or the most trusted members of the court nobility. These officials possessed no hereditary claim to their positions, serving at the pleasure of their divine sovereign, and returning to Memphis when their terms concluded, carrying with them the tribute and reports that kept the central administration informed of conditions throughout the realm. Their residences in the provincial capitals were modest affairs compared to the grandeur of Memphis, temporary seats of borrowed authority that reflected their status as representatives rather than rulers in their own right. As the fifth dynasty unfolded, and the pharaohs began to divide their attention between the traditional royal mortuary complexes and the growing influence of the solar cult at Heliopolis, the character of provincial governance began to shift with the changing currents of royal priority. The great distances that separated Memphis from the furthest reaches of Upper Egypt, where desert winds carried the scent of Nubian spices and the granite quarries of Aswan echoed with the songs of stoneworkers, began to assert their own logic upon the machinery of government. Communications that once flowed swiftly along the river highways now faced delays as resources were redirected to support the pharaoh's religious obligations. And provincial governors found themselves making increasingly independent decisions in matters that would once have required direct consultation with the royal court. In the limestone cliffs overlooking the provincial towns, where centuries of Nile floods had carved terraces into the bedrock and ancient burial chambers held the remains of local dignitaries, the nomarchs began to establish their own ancestral seats. The practice of burying provincial officials in elaborate rock-cut tombs within their territories, rather than transporting their remains to the royal cemeteries near Memphis, represented more than a mere change in funerary custom. These monuments, decorated with scenes of local life and agricultural abundance, proclaimed a growing identification between the governors and the lands they administered, a sense of belonging that transcended their roles as temporary royal appointees. The walls of these tombs told stories not of service to distant pharaohs, but of mastery over local resources, depicting the governors receiving tribute from regional officials and overseeing the harvest festivals that marked the rhythm of provincial life. The architectural evolution of provincial administrative centers during this period reflected the growing confidence and autonomy of their occupants. Where once modest compounds had sufficed for governors who expected to return to Memphis within a few years, elaborate palace complexes began to rise from the desert floors of provincial capitals. These structures, built from local materials and decorated in regional styles that subtly departed from the rigid conventions of court art, housed not only the governors themselves, but entire dynasties of hereditary officials, whose claims to authority rested as much on local tradition as on royal appointment. The great halls where provincial courts convened echoed with the deliberations of men who had spent their entire lives within the boundaries of their nomes, who understood the seasonal patterns of local agriculture and the ancient boundaries between neighboring settlements with an intimacy that no Memphis-appointed administrator could hope to match. As the Sixth Dynasty dawned and Pepi I ascended the throne in Memphis, the transformation of provincial governance had advanced beyond the point where royal authority could easily reverse its course. The nomarchs had become indispensable to the functioning of the state. Their deep roots in regional society and their intimate knowledge of local conditions, making them far more effective administrators than any officials who might be dispatched from the capital. The pharaoh's attempts to maintain central control increasingly took the form of ceremonial confirmations of authority that the provincial governors already possessed in practice, royal seals and titles that legitimized arrangements that had already crystallized through decades of gradual evolution. The great festivals that brought the nomarchs to Memphis for the major religious celebrations of the royal calendar became occasions for negotiation rather than simple displays of submission. Gatherings where the representatives of the provinces arrived with their own retinues and their own agendas, treating with the pharaoh more as allies than as subjects. The economic foundations that supported this transformation lay deep in the agricultural abundance of the provincial districts, where the annual flood cycle created wealth that no longer flowed automatically toward the royal treasuries. The nomarchs controlled not only the collection of taxes and tribute, but the entire process by which the surplus production of their territories was converted into the trade goods and manufactured items that sustained Egyptian civilization. Their workshops produced the fine linens and carved reliefs that decorated local temples. Their granaries stored the wheat that fed provincial populations during lean years. And their trading expeditions ventured into the desert regions and foreign lands that lay beyond the traditional sphere of royal monopoly. The wealth that accumulated in provincial centres supported local building projects and religious foundations that rivaled the monuments of Memphis in their scale and ambition, creating alternative centres of cultural and political gravity that drew talent and resources away from the traditional heart of the kingdom. The religious dimension of this provincial ascendancy manifested itself in the construction of elaborate temples dedicated to local deities whose cults had flourished in regional centres long before the unification of Egypt under the Pharaohs. The nomarchs presented themselves as the divine protectors of these ancient traditions, building monuments that celebrated their role as intermediaries between the provincial populations and the gods who governed local fertility and prosperity. These temples, rising from the desert landscapes like islands of carved stone and painted relief, proclaimed the spiritual authority of their patrons with a confidence that subtly challenged the pharaoh's monopoly on divine kingship. The festivals that celebrated the local deities drew pilgrims from throughout the surrounding countryside, creating networks of religious and economic connection that operated independently of the royal cult centres and their associated bureaucracies. By the time Pepi II assumed the throne as a child and began his extraordinarily long reign, the provincial governors had established themselves as permanent fixtures in the Egyptian political landscape. Hereditary rulers whose authority derived as much from local tradition and economic control as from royal appointment. The great distances that separated Memphis from the furthest reaches of the kingdom had created spaces where alternative forms of legitimacy could flourish, where the pharaoh's divine authority competed with more immediate and tangible sources of power. The nomarchs ruled from palace complexes that functioned as independent courts, surrounded by administrative hierarchies that owed their primary loyalty to regional rather than royal interests, governing populations that looked to local rather than distant sources of protection and prosperity. The implications of this transformation extended far beyond the mere redistribution of administrative responsibility. The Old Kingdom's conception of divine kingship had rested upon the pharaoh's unique position as the sole intermediary between the human and divine realms, the living God whose authority derived directly from his cosmic role in maintaining the balance of creation. The rise of the provincial governors represented a fundamental challenge to this theological foundation, creating alternative centers of authority that possessed their own claims to legitimacy and their own relationships with the divine powers that governed Egyptian life. The stage was being set for the dissolution of the unified state that had defined Egyptian civilization for nearly half a millennium, as the centrifugal forces of regional autonomy prepared to overcome the centripetal pull of Memphis and its ancient claims to universal dominion. The great limestone blocks of Giza stand silent now against the desert wind, their perfectly fitted joints weathered by millennia of sandstorms that have carved gentle curves into edges once sharp as blade cuts. These monuments, built during humanity's first golden age of architectural ambition, have watched the Nile flood and recede through 4,000 seasons, their shadows marking time like the world's most patient sundial. The pharaohs who commanded their construction sleep in darkness far below, their names carved in hieroglyphs that grow fainter with each passing century, though their pyramids remain as permanent as mountains thrust up from the earth itself. As the fourth dynasty drew to its close, the fever dream of pyramid building began to cool, like metal pulled from a forge. The successors of Khufu and Khafre found themselves ruling an empire drained by the colossal expenditures of stone and human labor that had defined their predecessors' reigns. The quarries of Aswan grew quiet, their granite faces no longer echoing with the ring of copper chisels and the songs of workers hauling massive blocks onto wooden sledges. The great ramps that had spiraled around rising pyramids were dismantled, their mud bricks returning to the earth from which they came, leaving only mysterious channels carved into bedrock to hint at the engineering marvels that once transformed raw stone into monuments touching the sky. The royal workshops of Memphis, where craftsmen had perfected the delicate art of pyramid construction, began turning their attention to smaller projects. Stone sarcophagi still emerged from these studios, but they lacked the mathematical precision and overwhelming scale that had characterized the great age of building. Mastaba tombs, those rectangular monuments that had served nobility before the pyramid era, experienced a renaissance as court officials found themselves unable to fund the elaborate burial complexes their grandfathers had taken for granted. These structures, built of mud brick rather than limestone, seemed almost humble beside the towering monuments of Giza, yet they represented a return to architectural traditions rooted deeper in Egyptian soil than the pyramid fever that had seized the kingdom for barely a century. Religious practices, too, began shifting like sand dunes, reshaped by changing winds. The solar cult of Ra, which had reached its zenith during the Pyramid Age, found itself sharing sacred space with older deities whose worship had never entirely disappeared from temple courtyards and household shrines. Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, reasserted his influence over royal ceremonies, while Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, gained prominence among scribes who increasingly questioned the wisdom of bankrupting the kingdom for burial monuments. In the quieter temples of provincial towns, priests maintained rituals that predated the pyramid builders by centuries, their ceremonies following rhythms as ancient as the Nile's flood cycle itself. The pharaohs of the 5th dynasty, inheriting a kingdom transformed by their predecessors' monumental ambitions, found themselves ruling over a more complex realm than their ancestors had known. Provincial governors, empowered by the massive organizational requirements of pyramid construction, had grown accustomed to exercising authority far from the royal court. These nobles built elaborate tombs for themselves, decorating their walls with scenes of daily life, painted in colors that glowed like jewels in lamplight. Their artists developed a more intimate style of representation, showing not just the idealized pharaoh performing ritual duties, but real people engaged in recognizable activities. Farmers plowing fields, bakers kneading dough, children playing games that Egyptian youngsters would recognize thousands of years later. Trade routes established to supply pyramid construction remained active long after the great building projects ended, creating a network of connections that brought exotic goods flowing into Egypt from lands where different stars wheeled overhead. Cedar wood from Lebanon continued arriving at Egyptian ports, though now it was destined for royal furniture rather than pyramid boats. Gold from Nubian mines still traveled north along the Nile, but increasingly it adorned the necks of provincial officials rather than disappearing into royal burial chambers. Lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan found its way into jewelry worn by Memphis merchants, while turquoise from Sinai mines decorated amulets protecting children whose great-grandparents had never owned anything more valuable than copper tools. The royal court itself grew more elaborate and ceremonious, as if compensating for the reduced scale of royal building projects through increased complexity of ritual and protocol. Courtiers developed an intricate hierarchy of titles and honors, creating a social structure as carefully fitted as pyramid blocks, though built from tradition and ceremony rather than stone. The pharaoh's daily routine became a series of sacred performances. Each meal and meeting transformed into religious observances that reinforced divine kingship through repetition rather than through monuments visible from the horizon. Palace gardens flourished during this period, filled with flowering trees and reflecting pools that created earthly paradises, requiring constant attention but leaving no trace for later archaeologists to discover. Art and literature experienced a flowering during these twilight years of the Old Kingdom, as if creative energy previously channeled into pyramid construction found new outlets in more intimate forms of expression. Craftsmen who had learned precision from pyramid workshops applied their skills to jewelry and furniture of extraordinary delicacy, creating objects that would have seemed almost impossibly refined to earlier generations. The earliest known literature appeared during this period, including wisdom texts that advised readers on proper behavior and the complexities of living in an increasingly sophisticated society. These writings, copied on papyrus that has mostly crumbled to dust, represented humanity's first attempts to capture human experience in words designed to outlast their authors' lives. As the Old Kingdom entered its final centuries, the kingdom's center of gravity gradually shifted away from the pyramid fields of Memphis toward the provinces, where local traditions had survived the imperial grandeur of the Pyramid Age. Regional dialects, suppressed during the height of royal power, began reasserting themselves in local inscriptions and administrative documents. Gods and goddesses, whose worship had been eclipsed by the solar religion of the pyramid builders, found new devotees among people who remembered their grandparents' stories about deities who controlled floods and harvests, rather than cosmic journeys through the underworld. This religious diversification reflected a broader cultural shift toward local autonomy that would ultimately reshape Egyptian civilization. The Nile itself seemed to participate in this transformation, as if responding to the reduced human pressure on its resources. Flood levels, carefully recorded by royal scribes, showed a pattern of abundance that allowed provincial communities to flourish without constant demands for tribute to fund royal construction projects. Villages that had sent their young men to die in Aswan quarries now kept their populations at home, developing local crafts and agricultural techniques that would sustain Egyptian civilization through the political upheavals to come. The Great River carried silt and prosperity to communities that had learned to thrive without constant royal oversight, creating a foundation of local strength that would prove more durable than the monuments that had defined the Pyramid Age. In the desert beyond the cultivated fields, nomadic peoples who had been pressed into service during the great construction projects returned to their ancient patterns of seasonal migration. These Bedouin tribes, carriers of traditions older than Egyptian civilization itself, watched the kingdom's transformation with the patient wisdom of people who had seen empires rise and fall like grass after rain. Their oral histories, passed down through generations around desert campfires, preserved memories of Egypt before the pyramids, when the Sahara was green and different peoples followed different gods across landscapes that would one day become sand. They understood, with the intuition of people whose lives followed natural rhythms rather than royal commands, that the age of pyramid building had been an aberration in human history, a brief moment when kingship had achieved a scale and ambition that could not be sustained indefinitely. The transition toward what historians would later call the Middle Kingdom proceeded with the gradual inevitability of seasonal change, unmarked by dramatic events, but profound in its long-term consequences. Power decentralized slowly, authority dispersed among regional leaders who had learned governance during the Pyramid Age but adapted it to local needs and traditions. This transformation would ultimately prove beneficial, creating a more resilient civilization than the top-heavy pyramid kingdom had ever been. But it marked the end of an era when human ambition had achieved its most stunning architectural expression. The Great Pyramids remained, would always remain, standing against the desert sky like permanent reminders of what had once been possible, when kings dreamed in stone and entire kingdoms dedicated themselves to building bridges between earth and eternity.